Welcome to the show, Michael Lombardi. It's a pretty big guest, a pretty big get for Conduct Detrimental. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
I'm good to be here. Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's always good to talk football, law, whatever you want to talk about. So I'm happy to be here.
So for those watching on video, I'm holding up Mike's new book, Football Done Right. It's a must buy right alongside Gridiron Genius, another book that I have purchased in the past. So we're certainly going to talk about Mike's new book today. But for those that don't know Mike, we wanted to get into the appropriate background, kind of how Mike kind of got through the noise as a GM to get into the sports media space with Vissen and Ringer and the stuff you're doing with Adnan. So yeah, I guess we can start from here. Mike, what's the transition like from GM to sports media? I'm kind of most fascinated there.
You know, it kind of was it was serendipitous a little bit. When I was working in Philadelphia, I ran the draft in Philadelphia in the 1998 draft. In April, we drafted Trey Thomas. We traded for Hugh Douglas, Jeremiah Trotter, Allen Rossum, Brandon Whiting. We had a really good draft. I got fired 3 weeks later. Okay, they brought Tom Modrak in to be the general manager. And I was out of work. And a friend of mine, Mike Ornstein, called me on the phone and said, "Hey, CBS is looking for a guy behind the scenes. Would you like to do that? You know, you could really help them." And the show was George Seifert, Brent Jones, Marcus Allen, and the great Jim Nantz. I said, "Yeah, sure." So I drove up. I met Eric Mann, and I started with CBS, and I was getting paid by the Eagles. I still had time on a contract, and I went up and started working for them. And then after about 3 weeks, Eric Mann, the producer, said, "We'll put you on the air." And by the end of the year, I was on the desk, and so that kind of how I got started in it. And then when I left the Raiders and I moved back to New Jersey, I kind of just picked it up. And so it's just kind of been natural. I went back in the league after NFL Network, and then I came back out, and I was fortunate enough to get with VEASAN now. As this whole betting market, Dan, exploded, as you know. I mean, it just was the perfect time.
Well, I was listening to you get an interview recently with Bill Simmons, and I guess I don't know if this is true or not true, but you didn't correct him that Bill Simmons kind of introduced you to the gambling concept, how to apply your brain to the betting world.
Yeah, no question he did. I mean, I don't bet. I didn't know anything about betting. I had no idea, but I know teams. And my whole job in the NFL was handicapping teams, strengths, weaknesses. Here's this team versus that team. That's part of what I've loved about football, is to analyze that. And so I don't ever really, I don't sit there and say, the line's too far or this is too high. I just say, hey, here's what I think. Here's the breakdown of the game. This is a good matchup. Okay, let's take opening weekend, right? You got Vic Fangio, Miami Dolphins defense coordinator, against Kellen Moore, offensive coordinator of the Chargers. Well, if you study the league, Vic has given Kellen a lot of trouble. He knows him, he understands him. So that's the kind of stuff that I talk about. Not, hey, if the line moves from 5 to 4, I'm all in. That's not me.
Well, I'll give you a compliment here, and I'm sure you've been hearing many of them on your book tour. But I listen to a lot of gambling shows. I first found you on the Ringer a couple of years ago. And I'm not someone that listens to a lot of gambling shows, but the way that you were analyzing football was essentially kind of gambling advice, but you weren't talking about the line. You were just saying, if X happens and Y happens, think practically about the scenario. So as I told you offline, you have won me a decent amount of money over the years, but you have a very unique voice that you've brought to the space. So we're certainly happy to have you on the
I appreciate it.
side.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been good. It's been good. I didn't want it, Dan. I didn't want to be one of those guys that spent 35 years in the league and then just faded away. I want to have a second career. And I fortunate enough that I met when I was writing Gridiron Genius. I was living in Los Angeles. I knew George Raveling. We had been friends before, but we started being really good friends. And he told me the best experience of his life happened from when he turned 62 to present. I wanted to kind of have that same feel.
Oh, it's awesome. So yeah, like Dan said, thank you for hopping on. Obviously, since you've done pretty much everything in the NFL almost, I mean, where does writing rank for you, I guess, in your coverage of football? I mean, it's way different than like the broadcast and digital side that you've done.
Mike, it's interesting. Today, we're taping this on a Wednesday. Gil Brandt passed away, 91 years old, the former player personnel director of the Dallas Cowboys. And I started with the 49ers in 84, and we belonged to a combine, San Francisco, Seattle, Dallas, and Buffalo. Those four teams had their own little combine, and Gil kind of ran it. And even though we didn't use the grading system, Gil used to give out tutorials on how to write a report. Now, this is way before you were born. So in 84, when you went to go watch a player, you had to write the player up so that the person reading the report could visualize that player, right? You had to really be descriptive in your words. You had to, and so he couldn't go to YouTube and watch them. He couldn't go to his computer and watch games. That was it. I tell the story all the time. I got 3 cans of film on Jerry Rice. I put them on Bill's desk. And, 3 months later, people were giving me shit for not sending that tape back. And the film back, and because he had it on his desk. And one of my biggest regrets in life, he had a note attached to it, said John Jefferson ... with speed, which was the ultimate compliment in 84. But anyway, so you had it really right. And so when I became a scout in 84 with the 49ers, I learned how to write and try to describe in my own voice. And then I've always been a reader. So I think it's kind of crossed over. And I love writers. I read all different kind of books. I find writers to be really interesting people. And I always wanted to write. And I knew that after I spent time with Al, I knew that having been with Belichick, having been with Walsh, I knew that there was a book in there somewhere.
So I think on that, and Mike, certainly you have a unique perspective, and I think people should get the book. I think you have an interesting voice for this, but I wanted to kind of go into some kind of player-based scenario. So we'll certainly, if time permitting, we wanted to go over, the thought process that goes through trading for someone like a Deshaun Watson, number one, or drafting a guy like Jalen Carter. But I think the news of the month is this Johnny Manziel documentary about like this troubled guy who, I don't know if everybody knew his demons, but certainly I don't know if I see you were with the Browns from 2013 to 2014. Had you left before they drafted him? Were you there the year before?
It's a good story. It's a good story. It wasn't in the documentary.
I'll take it, but I'm sure there's some stories there.
When I came into the Browns in 13, there was hope that Brandon Weeden would be a good quarterback. And we started an analytical department. Joe Banner started an analytical department to try to research what a good quarterback was. And one of the things that I truly believed that we needed to know about the player's character. So I met a girl online that was applying for a job. She went to a directional school in Louisiana, but she lived in Baton Rouge. And she would constantly send me emails about players. I know this player, I know that player, I know this player, I know that player. And you should hire me. I could really help you on character. And so, I kind of push came to shove. And finally, after about 2 months, I brought her in, and she was kind of under the auspices of she was going to do radio because she had a media background. And she did radio, but she was also our main information gatherer. And what she could find out about players, none of us could. And unfortunately, her name was Carly McCord. Unfortunately, she died in an airplane crash going to her husband's father's, the LSU championship game. She married Steve Eppinger. And so she was going to that game in that plane crash, but she knew all about Johnny. And she knew everything about Johnny. She knew about the off the field issues because she had an ability to the guard was down. And that's the only way you learn about players.
Right. Because it's funny that the Browns certainly, the draft pick comes a couple months after you leave the franchise, but you imagine, the Browns are looking for a quarterback. Manziel wins the Heisman the year before, that he was probably, at least teams were doing that year of advanced scouting. But certainly, watching this documentary, I don't know how much of it's true. You can kind of confirm or deny it, but at least we thought as lawyers, we talked about it a little bit in the show, certainly you could talk about his fall from grace at Texas A&M. But there's an interesting part of the documentary where the agent is kind of running interference and kind of putting up a smoke screen that Johnny is kind of drug free at the combine. And they're, right. That's the part that I think is this interesting song and dance, right? Those last kind of 2-3 months as you're leading up to the draft, do you believe the agents, right? Do you believe what's coming from them? How did that work I mean, we could use Johnny Manziel as the example, but that seems to be the
Right.
great mystery.
Well, I got fired. The greatest thing ever happened to me, Dan. I got fired in Cleveland. I had 2 years left on a contract. I got to go to 3
You
years.
landed okay, Mike.
And
with
I
the
got to
Super
go to
Bowl
New
winning
England and go
Patriots.
back and work for Bill. So I'm thankful to Jimmy Haslam to this day for that. But they fired her too. They basically removed her. Ray Farmer became the general manager, and he didn't want to listen to anything she had to say. She didn't think it was valuable. I did. And so they ignored all the things that she said, that she had heard, that she had pretty much validated on Johnny, and they went ahead and picked him, and they learned the hard way. But I think you have to be really careful. I'll give you the opposite story. I wrote about it in the book. Dan Marino. Now, Dan Marino, there was no better player in college football other than John Elway. And this was one of the great drafts of all time in the Marino draft. You've got Todd Blackledge, you've got Tony Eason, you've got all these quarterbacks in this draft. And I forget the other one, Eason, the kid from Cal Davis, too. Anyway, so you've got all these quarterbacks in the draft, and Marino is moving down because a Pittsburgh newspaper had put some stuff out that he had off the field issues, which were not true. And he had Marvin Demoff as an agent, and Demoff couldn't put the fires out. He couldn't put the fires out. Nobody was buying it, and he slipped all the way down to Miami, and that's why he got it. And
you mentioned a similar story about Warren Sapp, that you guys got bad information in the same sense.
We got that from the league office. The league office called. I mean, the guy in charge of the league office, security, delivered that. And I'll never forget that day. That's on me, because you should never listen to somebody else. You should do your own research. And that's on me. I mean, I because of the league umbrella, you hear that stuff. But, it's like anything, and I learned a lot of this from working with Al, you can only trust very few. What Sherlock Holmes believed, that there's only one person you get information from that's reliable. Everybody else just has an agenda, and I think that's true.
So going off, obviously, hearing from people around the league, Jalen Carter, this past draft with the Eagles. I mean, I imagine balancing the need to win with also like maintaining a team's reputation. And, it's getting increasingly difficult today with social media and just constant kind of news stories coming out. So how do you approach evaluating like a Jalen Carter for the Eagles, and like the risk reward of kind of signing someone like that or drafting a player of that nature?
Well, I think a lot of it starts with, how bad the problems are. I mean, we know about the off the field car accident. We know about what happened there. You got to go down there and get the truth. You can't rely on somebody else, so you have to find that out. And then you have to ask yourself, after you bring the kid in, what is the total package? Who's going to be part of his family? Who's going to be with them? Who else are you dealing with in this relationship that you're going to take embark on? And then how important is football to him? Look, Lawrence Taylor off the field, there were a lot of issues, but Lawrence Taylor, when the ball got snapped, was ready to go. And I'm not apologizing for Lawrence's off the field issues, but they never interfered with him in terms of becoming a good player. He loved football. And he wasn't doing criminal things. He was out drinking or having a good time, whatever he was doing. So I think, to me, you have to really balance it. And there's no one rule for everybody. But what you must do today, more than anything, when I started in '84, you could call the assistant coaches on the phone and they would tell you the truth. Now they lie to you, and they have to. They have to. They're not going to hurt their program. You can't take their word as gold. And so you have to find ways to get information. It's really one of the back ways of scouting. We still scout as if it's 1984 and everybody's going to go look at 16 millimeter tape. Right, I could sit right here at this desk, turn on this machine, and watch every Texas A&M game I want to watch. But what I can't find out is the character of the player. We sent Jim Schwartz to the Playboy All-American photo shoot at the Biltmore. Gil Brandt ran it, God rest his soul. And we sent Schwartz, and we told him, don't wear one thing that says Cleveland Browns, act like you work for the hotel, and you come back and tell us what you saw about all these players. I still have the report he wrote up. It's incredible. He nailed every guy. He called Ray Lewis like it was, he knew it. He had dynamic leadership skills. That's the information you have to have. So on Jalen Carter, If you can't get to that, you got to find a way to do it.
So I'll tell you, just while we're staying on this year's draft, I mean, there's stories now. You have to be very careful, right? And now this really could apply to any circumstance. But if you hire a professional interview coach, you get very monotonous, right? You turn into the Derek Jeter. You don't give anybody any sound bites or anything like that. Now, there was a story kind of on the opposite side of Jalen Carter. Anthony Richardson was seen after one of these combine days, like picking up trash, and just so much so that people could see it. Then Anthony Richardson, who was at one point a liability, you had a no completion percentage in college, all of a sudden rockets up the draft boards to be a top 5 guy. How do you separate the stuff that is kind of put on for the cameras, put on for the media, versus what someone's genuine activity? I feel like that's harder in 2023 than it's ever been before.
You got to watch them when they don't think you're watching them. That's the most important time. You got to go to, you shouldn't go to the football office anymore. Go to the local bar. Where do they hang out? You go to the football office, you're going to get the same crap. The other thing you have to do is you can't listen to people. You have to have almost a complete ability to block out noise, right? And you can't make the decision. I wrote about this for the Daily Coach the other day. You can't allow people to shape the information. If a scout likes a player, he may shape the character. If the scout doesn't like the player, he may shape the character. So you're trying to eliminate bias every single way you go. And the only chance you have is to rely on pure information when people think they're being watched.
So I think that's a good transition here. A story that we spent a lot of time over the last, it's no one's paying attention to anymore, but the Deshaun Watson cases are not actually done. There are 2 that are still pending in the courts. We'll see when those trials are going to be had, but people seem to forget that there are still active cases here. Now, I teach a sports law class, and I bring this up every semester. How does a player who go from the verge of potentially being released if he was indicted for a felony, within 1 week's time, get a $230 million fully guaranteed contract? Something changed in a very dramatic way. And just, as memory serves, and I just did it for my class the other day, but there was a bidding war all of a sudden for this kind of toxic asset. And then, the Atlanta Falcons wanted him, the Saints wanted him, allegedly the Panthers and the Browns, I guess, according to some reports, were out because he didn't want to go to a cold weather city. Now, all of a sudden, we know what happens in hindsight, a $230 million fully guaranteed contract to Deshaun Watson in the midst of all of his different legal battles. So, Mike, you've had, 20 plus years in the front office of an organization, including some time at the Browns, obviously under a different regime. How does something like that happen that just doesn't seem to align with the public sentiment on a player from an on-field standpoint, off-field standpoint? But then again, it's a record-setting contract, the sense of that we might never see again, a fully guaranteed, $200 million plus contract. I'm not sure if we're going to see that.
I think sometimes people can't tell their desperation from their courage. I think the Browns Jimmy Haslam had been work for him. He was obsessed with trying to find a quarterback, thought it was Brandon Whedon when he bought the team, thought it was Johnny Manziel, all those things. And I think this opportunity, he had to do something uniquely different. And they obviously had information on the kid. Again, I don't know if it's accurate, but they had information that they presented to their decision makers that they all agreed on wasn't going to be able, they could live with this. And I think each organization is different when it comes to that. I think and that comes from the owner, right? For me, I want the owner to tell me what does he want? What does he want? What was he willing to tolerate? I mean, now today, guys are just getting fined from smoking marijuana. They're not getting suspended. But back in the day, we would ask the question, would we take somebody who got caught smoking marijuana? That was a big thing, right? And so you've got to find out what's your tolerance for the behavior. And if you don't have a structure in place, a culture that you're building, it's kind of hard. You're always asking it. It's always a line item question as opposed to, look, that guy doesn't fit for us. And I think the Browns were I don't think they were courageous. I think they were desperate.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, especially when it comes to like, if they fit there, having them in a locker room, we go to kind of the Jonathan Taylor situation right now. Obviously there's a lot going on, at least in my lifetime, like labor negotiations and collective bargaining agreements. Like it's changed a lot and structured how the NFL kind of operates now, especially with the Deshaun deal, and now the running backs are like the latest position to kind of cause a scene. How do you guys find those common grounds between the players, the teams? And obviously you just mentioned you're speaking to Jimmy Haslam, but like who, how do you guys negotiate and have those commonalities in that?
Well, I think it's really become easier because everybody's looking at similar data, right? And again, you've got to have a philosophy on how you want to build a team. I mean, the Eagles, for example, have never put money into running backs. I'm talking about money, safeties, running backs, linebackers. That's just Jeff Lurie, and I worked for him, believes in offensive and defensive linemen. That's what he believes, and a quarterback. And so that drives the organization's decision making. And that's what you need for an owner. You need them to say, okay, I want to be, this is the kind of team I want. This is the kind of team I want. And then let's go build it. And I think that's how you drive it. And I think, to me, we have so much data out there on, you can't pay for something that there's a lot of. You have to, this goes back years ago, you have to draft what you can't buy. You have to draft what you can't buy. You can, people keep taking receivers early, some hit, some don't. The Eagles got away with taking Rieger over Jefferson, and the next year that, they made up for that. But, there's so many mistakes at receiver that often happen that you take one early. But if you don't have a left tackle, if you don't have defensive rushers, if you don't have defensive linemen, you don't have offensive linemen, you're not going to win. So it's how you want to build a team, and I think that's really what drives your structure. But a lot of it comes from the owner, because if you do everything on I like that player, I don't like that player, it violates every rule of scouting. You either have a philosophy or you don't. Green Bay, for all those years, they had a philosophy. This is who they were. This is what they were doing. Same thing with New England. New England has a philosophy. This is who they are. You know what they're going to do. It's the teams that constantly change their philosophy that can't ever catch up.
So sticking on the running backs one, and then just going back to your book for a second. I was going through we won't spoil the top guys in the book, but in your top 25, I count 3 running backs. So in no particular order, people can buy the book to see the full list. But we have Jim Brown, we have Barry Sanders, we have Walter Payton, in no particular order within the top 25. Certainly in the history of the NFL, when I grew up, running backs, those are the players you gravitated towards. The running game set up everything else. And I think, to your point, I think people have realized maybe that the quarterback and the offensive line and the holes created, that's really the function of the running back game. That said, you could still have star power that's created. So, we try to be at the intersection here of, sports and the law, football and the law. Maybe you could speak to this a little bit, and I'm not sure how much background you have in it, but when I grew up, I remember, people talk about Madden. I remember the Quarterback Club video game with Brett Favre on the cover. I remember the Quarterback Club being a separate, a chapter within the union. So Dan Marino, who we spoke about a little bit, Elway, Warren Moon, Randall Cunningham, Troy Aikman, that was a separate subset within the general NFLPA. So I guess the question I have for you, Mike, people are trying to figure out how to solve this running backs question. Certainly there's a ton of value attributed to running backs. I'm not exactly sure how to solve it. If you get rid of the franchise tag for running backs, if you have a separate union for running backs, do you have any solutions here? I find it to be,
No.
I'm not sure what we do here.
I don't know why we have to do anything. It's been collectively bargained. It's the law of supply and demand. I mean, it's really not that complicated. There's a lot of backs out there. When I went through it, Jim Brown was drafted as a fullback. The league was 2 backs. Jim Brown, he was the fullback. There was a halfback. Barry Sanders, we were really a 2-back league. Emmitt Smith, we were a 2-back league. Walter Payton, we were a 2-back league. Remember, before you were born, they had a block like this for pass protection, right? They couldn't extend their arms. So the passing game wasn't something that people really could take advantage of. It was hard. I mean, the Packers got sacked 9 times in the Ice Bowl because you couldn't, nobody could block like this. So you had to run the ball. That was your only advantage you had, was run the football. The Packers sweep, the Miami Dolphins don't throw it more than 14 times in a 72 season. I mean, it's a game. So the changing of the rules, the evolution of it has changed. I think the bigger argument, Dan, is what are you doing with these tight ends? They're not tight ends. Kyle Pitts isn't a tight end. Travis Kelce's not a tight end. Evan Ingram's not a tight end. and you're getting away with paying them less than the receivers, which is really what they are. Kelsey's one of the selfless players of the league. He could demand to be the highest paid receiver in the league and have an argument that he should be. And yet he takes a contract for a tight end. How do you fix that problem?
Fair. It's a very fair point.
You're going to have every problem. You're going to have problems in any collective bargain system. And if you sit there and say, well, there were 24 running backs that got contract extensions. 20 of them didn't make it through the second contract.
Right.
Like, it's a bad investment when you come double down on it. Now, what do the Patriots do with Rondo Stevenson? He's really good. Does Tony? I mean, I'd like him on my team. I love Nick Chubb on my team, but Nick Chubb took a pretty good contract. He didn't try to get 20 million. You know, Jonathan Taylor wants 17, 16 million. You start paying that, you got to take it from somewhere else.
The question is, to your point, Mike, it as much as, you know, we can ask an academic question, but it is somewhat of a self-inflicted wound. You said it right at the beginning. It's collectively bargained for. And just the way that, you know, there's 11 players on each side of the ball, is 53 men on a roster. How much space do the running backs take up in terms of voting rights? A very small fraction of that, right? In order to pass the CBA, even if, let's say, you had all the running backs that voted against it, you had a block of running backs that voted against a particular deal's still going to pass. That's why, you know, we're trying to get creative, but I think the NFL right now, and to your point, it's a fair market. Whatever someone wants to pay for a player is what they're worth. There is an interesting argument that I'm seeing more and more online that the franchise tag is specifically applied to running backs. It hits a little bit differently. Is that a problem? Is that something that running backs want to stand up and do? But then, right, you have guys like Saquon Barkley who, instead of putting up, making a stand, he signs the deal, right? Austin Eckler is kind of a put up or shut up type year. Josh Jacobs signs the contract. So it's only a problem if the players want to stand up and make it a problem. Otherwise, people just want to take their money and just kind of go into the background with it.
Why did anybody think Taylor was going to sign a huge deal? Eckler was available all off season. Nobody signed him. Right. He's got 36 touchdowns. You put Eckler in the red zone, he's really tough. Here's what I would say. If I were a father of a running back, I would tell him to train himself as a receiver, because when you have a running back that can play receiver, now you're talking about a weapon. That's the only reason McCaffrey got that contract. McCaffrey's contract, we would be laughing at that contract. He would be a cap casualty right now if he were still on the Carolina Panthers. But because he went to a team that is really different in terms of their multidimensional ability to shift positions. Debo's a running back. McCaffrey's a receiver. You know, he highlights the game. The offense doesn't run through McCaffrey. He highlights the offense. He accelerates the offense. So I think, to me, we're going to always have this, because college running backs that come into the league, if they're trained in the passing game, are going to be huge.
I definitely want to, kind of pivot a little bit to just the book. When it comes to writing, we mentioned
cover, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's football to me. Like, it's just very, it represents football well. And, obviously with all the experiences, when you were writing, did you have, I know you mentioned a few of them, but like some of the favorite memories or like emotions while you were writing that were coming up that maybe you either didn't want to put in, or like, maybe something that got you a little emotional, reminiscing on?
I mean, I always was, when I thought about Coach Walsh a lot in that book, I thought about Lombardi when I was writing him, and Jack Venisi, who's an untold, really superstar of the National Football League that nobody really knows about. He can't even get his name up on the Packer wall of the stadium. And yet he was responsible for drafting most of those players that are now in the Hall of Fame. And because he didn't have the title general manager, they won't acknowledge him. And everybody knows, including Lombardi, who came back from the airport after they won the Western Conference in 1960 and thanked him. He had just died earlier that month. So, yeah, there's a lot of that goes through it. I really enjoyed writing the book because it was fun. It wasn't hard. I felt like it was educational for me too, and then to try to find an angle to talk about each player that would be different than an angle that you would have read in another book. The Barry Sanders story about how he fell in love with football because of the electric game of football. The Otto Graham story about Billy DeCorvant, the running back from high school, who drew 100,000 people to high school games in Chicago, and he was the star of Chicago. And yet Otto Graham had to go play basketball at Northwestern, and they saw him throwing in the courtyard, and they made him play. So there's all that stuff. And then I didn't realize it at the time. I mean, Joe Montana was a hair from being a Chicago Bear. Bill Tobin's wife, Duke Tobin's mom, says to Bill Tobin on the morning of the draft, "Promise me you'll draft Joe Montana." And he says, "If he's there in the third, we'll take him." Well, he was there in the third, and they took Willie McClendon from Georgia, the running back. I don't know why, but then Bill took Montana. So there's so much of that really I wanted to add that to the book, because I didn't think people really knew that enough, and I really wanted to highlight a lot of the older players and dispel this notion that they couldn't play today, like Buckus couldn't play today, or Jim Brown couldn't play today, or it's nonsense. Like Lance Allworth. When we traded for Randy Moss, when I traded for Randy Moss in Oakland, I went into Al Davis's office and I think I got him. I said, this guy's going to be the best receiver we'll ever have, and I got my ass ripped because the best receiver to Al Davis was Lance Allworth.
Let's end on this, Mike. We could keep you a long time, but I think on that, speaking of kind of comparing previous generations to the new generation, I was born in '88. So there's certain players in this list. Like I was on a radio show recently and someone said, "Who's the greatest football player of all time?" And I said, "I don't know, probably Brady." And they're like, "Lawrence Taylor," and it's not even close. And it's like, I grew up when Lawrence, I was an infant as Lawrence Taylor was wreaking havoc. But I think your book does a good job at kind of bridging the gap between the past and the present. So, certainly you could have if we haven't said it, Mike has a top 100 list right at the back of his book after all of his various stories. There's a player on the list, and I think you'll appreciate the story. I have a daughter. I have two daughters, 4 and 2, and I bought her like a baseball legends alphabet book, and for every letter it gives you a fun fact. So like Hank Aaron is A, Yogi Berra is B. So we're getting through the book, and she understands very little, and we get to Jackie Robinson, and I'm explaining to her, Jackie Robinson is a real life superhero. He wanted to play baseball, but the mean men weren't letting him play. Like, she understands this concept. I think baseball is very good at looking back and appreciating their legends. I think football less so for whatever reason. I'm not really sure why. You have a player all the way number 100, and I'm happy you found a way to put him in the book, Kenny Washington, who has a lot in common with Jackie Robinson. They're both at UCLA together. He's widely credited as being the first player to break the African-American color barrier in football, but it's a player that no one, I don't think many casual football fans know about. So, Mike, I guess I want to leave with this. It's a book that I think people can learn a lot about. Maybe an anecdote or something that you learned about Kenny Washington that people should learn. As football historians, we're all invested in the start of the season, but I think there's so much we can learn about history, and I think you do such a fantastic way of bridging the gap. But Kenny Washington is a guy people should know about.
Well, we would not have football in Los Angeles if it wasn't for Kenny Washington. That's a fact. So the city of Los Angeles, in order to get the Cleveland franchise to Los Angeles, they had to put black players on the team. They had to, or else the city of Los Angeles would not allow them to play in the Coliseum. And Kenny Washington broke the color barrier in football. There was a self-imposed, partly because of George Preston Marshall. George Preston Marshall is in the Hall of Fame. I don't know why, but he is. I mean, the Washington Redskin owner refused to allow black players into the league. He was the last NFL franchise, and it wasn't until Bobby Mitchell in the 60s that allowed black athletes to play on his team. Kenny Washington, after his senior season, flew back to the All-Star game in Chicago to play, and George Halas wanted to sign him. And Marshall was completely against this. And so we had this embargo on black athletes. In the early 20s, they could play. And then around 28, 29, it kind of weeded out. And then it wasn't until 46 that we started to get black athletes playing again. And the AFL was tremendous in helping the cause for black athletes. So Kenny Washington, to me, is the Jackie Robinson of the NFL. He broke the color barrier, and he basically gave football to Los Angeles. And I had to put him in because, when he walked off the field in his last game at UCLA, everybody thought he was the better athlete, the better talent than Jackie Robinson.
I think that's a great anecdote to end it on. Mike, the book is fantastic. Again, Football Done Right. And Mike, tell people where they can find you elsewhere other than the book.
Well, I do a show with VEASAN called the Lombardi Line every day. It'll be from 1 to 3 starting next week. The GM Shuffle with Femi Abebefe on the VEASAN DraftKings Network. I do that. I used to do it with Adnan over at Cadence 13. And then I do that. And the Daily Coach. We write a leadership blog. Coach Radling and I started this website called the Daily Coach. So those are the 3 places. I'm pretty active all over. I write for VEASAN, but I'm not hard to find. I'm around.
Great stuff, Mike. Thank you for sharing
Thank you, guys.
some
Thank you,
stories
Mike.
with us. It's excellent. Go out and buy the book. Rate, review all the good stuff on Amazon. Get that book up the list. Mike, thank you so much.
Dan. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.